Hello and welcome to the Sisters for Fitness Wellness Show. I'm Stephanie Gaines-Bryant. Our guest today is Dr. Renita Gabriel, and she's the author of the book, The Point of It All, A Faith-Based Guide to Successful Living. Welcome back.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So you wrote this book?
Yes.
And what I found was one of the most interesting things of the book, not just the content, but how you set it up. It's really a teaching manual. Why did you choose to do that?
I think for me, I am someone who learns by, having things broken down in a way that's, outlined and organized. And even in the field that I'm in, I'm a psychologist, and I've done a lot of reports, and the writing that I do for my job is very organized and very, kind of broken down so that anyone can follow it. And so it was very important to me that people were able to follow my train of thought and follow, what I was saying, and I was hoping to impart knowledge to people.
Now, you mentioned the fact that you're a psychologist, but that's not what you started out wanting to be. How did it happen? How did you get into psychology?
So that's very interesting. In my book, I talk about how there were lots of different things that I wanted to be when I grew up. One of them was I wanted to be a veterinarian for the longest time. And so I loved animals, and it was just really something that I was passionate about. But after a while, I was like, well, that's a lot of school. I don't know if I could do that. And, the pay, considering the pay, I didn't know if it was, going to be something that could financially sustain me. And then I eventually kind of got caught up in the whole idea of, making sure that you had a good job that would pay well and that you were set financially. And I also sort of got caught up in, giving my parents bragging rights, so I thought that I wanted to be a doctor. And so I was going to actually be a psychiatrist, but I was very interested in becoming a medical doctor, and I think that was somewhat imposed upon me, or I felt like it was imposed upon me. So I set out to do that in college, but unfortunately, I didn't do so well in some of the harder sciences, and so I pretty much failed my chemistry class, and so I got a little discouraged, but also it really wasn't my interest. The hard sciences wasn't really my interest. I did have an interest in working with people and counseling people, and that came earlier. I sort of had a revelation that, this is something that, maybe I should be doing.
What the book talks about is how your faith has guided you. You talked about how you got into psychology, but you began kind of working with your faith even earlier. How were you raised, as far as what faith were you raised in?
Sure, I was raised Catholic, actually, and a lot of times when you think of Catholicism, you think of more traditional, more, reserved, but I really learned a lot about Jesus through my Catholic faith. My mother was a devout Catholic, and she would often, share with us stories about Jesus and about God, and she was very involved with the church. There was a program called the CCD program. It was like a curriculum for young children. My mom taught that, and so I would, be in her classes and learn that way with other children. And so that really shaped my faith in the beginning. We had this, in my book I talk about when I was in elementary school, we used to attend Mass, and around the Lenten season we did something called Stations of the Cross, and that was where the priest would go through these visual depictions of the last hours of Jesus's life, and there were depictions of Jesus being beaten and falling down, and all the while he's walking by these depictions, and reading what is happening. And when I was about 7 years old, that story, I did this when I was probably like in first grade, but by second grade, it really resonated with me in a way that it hadn't before. And I remember feeling just such, I don't know, remorse and sensitivity towards what Jesus did for me, and I really understood that. I think at that age, I think I understood, well, to the extent that a 7-year-old could understand it. And then my faith was just nurtured after that. Like, I found myself, in situations where people were pouring into me. By the time I got to college, I actually left the Catholic faith because Protestantism, I can't even talk right now, but that, I felt like that resonated a little bit more with me as I became an adult. Like, I felt like with my particular experience with Protestantism, I felt like it really had you go to the Bible yourself and look through the Bible yourself, and that's how I really shaped or formed a relationship with God as an adult. Throughout my life, I feel like people have come in my life and poured into my life and helped shape my faith. But as a young person, it was Catholicism that started me out.
Let's talk about, in the book you talk about how you begin to determine your purpose. A lot of us are walking around, we're working jobs, we're living life, but we don't know what our true purpose in life is. How do you determine what your purpose is?
That's a great question. I feel like if you're in relationship with God, I do believe that He reveals that to you, and you're sensitive to things in your life. And so I definitely believe that it starts with having a relationship with God and a connection with Him. And you can pray for guidance in that area. But in my life, I feel like doors were opening and certain things would happen in my life, and I was really in tune with that. I'm like, you have me all, I'm always listening to people. People are always dumping their stuff on me, and I'm not asking for it. Not that I minded, but I always found myself in a capacity where I was listening or advising, and I'm like, I even had my own personal experience with counseling when I was a young person, and I really had a positive experience with that. So I think that you can certainly be in tune with sort of the direction that God may be leading you if you have a relationship with Him.
But a lot of people don't know how to listen for those answers. You say, go to God for answers to this and this. God may be giving you the answer, but if you can't hear it, what is your advice for people who want to know how to hear what's being given to them? Yeah,
that's a really good question, Stephanie. I think one of the things, especially in our society, is to get quiet and sort of unplug. I think we've talked about that before. Sometimes it's hard to hear anything when there's a whole bunch of background noise or ruckus like going on. And not to compare society to ruckus, but sometimes it can be quite noisy, right? And when I say that, I mean that, figuratively, not necessarily literally. And sometimes you do have to sort of detach yourself a little bit. I talk about in the book, sometimes retreating and, finding a quiet place or a quiet time that you can just be in tune with God. And sometimes that comes through reading the scriptures, sometimes listening to something, a podcast or a sermon, or just being alone with your own thoughts.
Exact stillness is so important. And I tell people 5 minutes a day. Take 5 minutes a day, and that 5 minutes might be as you're waking up in the morning. Just sit there 5 minutes in that stillness. Learn to be with yourself. Learn to be comfortable inside yourself. We live on the outside so much of our lives. Learn to be still within. Be still and know.
Oh, there you go. Amen. As you were talking, I was actually thinking about mindfulness, and I actually wrote a blog post about that, and I called the blog post Stop, Look, and Listen, and I talk about that in terms of, stop looking and listening, to yourself, and a lot of times we don't do that. So as you were talking, I was thinking about that. I think a lot of times people think that mindfulness has to be this esoteric, something that you can't relate to, but it's really as simple as, being still and listening, to yourself and being in tune with your thoughts.
How do you create a vision for yourself?
That's a really good question as well. She has such good questions. Vision comes from, again, I believe it comes from the Lord, but I think a lot of times it comes from what we see and what we experience. I think a lot of the times our visions can be limited by our exposure or by our experiences. Sometimes we talk about role models in my field. A lot of the times, what you see modeled is what you tend to do. We learn by what we see. And if you don't have any exposure, sometimes it can be hard to have vision. Now, God can gift you with vision. He can divinely reveal things to you, and also it can come from your exposure and your experiences. That's why, I don't know if you remember, there was a movement for the vision boards. Vision boards were big for a while.
Yes.
Yeah, and I actually have one personally.
Same.
You do? Yeah. And so, right, it's important
I have a couple.
Yeah. Right, and it can change. I talk about how it can be malleable. It can, change with how God moves in your life and what's happening in your life. But I think it's important to talk about writing the vision and making it plain, and so you can kind of see and know what to do. And so vision provides direction, and it also can provide hope.
So you're saying make sure you write down.
Write down, right. write down what your vision is, or you can, visualize, put it down in terms of like the vision board. Vision boards, for those of you who may not be familiar with it, it can be visual depictions of what you would like your life to look like, and there can be different areas that you'd like for, to kind of focus in on. And so you could take, whatever medium you'd like to use to put together this vision board. Oftentimes you talk about magazine clippings and you can actually see it. And for me, I'm actually a pretty visual person, and so I like to be able to see things. So that's one way you can do it, or you could write it.
My kids have always laughed because I have a vision board in the kitchen and I have one in my bedroom, and they laugh at the little pictures that I cut out of magazines. But it's good for me. It is actually, it helps me really put things into focus. Because if you, I believe, and it sounds so corny, if you can see it, you can be it.
That's true. That's true. And R. Kelly was onto something.
Another thing in our society we do is procrastinate. We put it off because it's when the kids get older, I can do this, or I'll do this later, and then later never comes. How do you prioritize? Put first things first.
Very, very good question. Again, so, when you talk about doing it later, I think my experience, with having the loss that I had, losing my dad, I think, certainly I've been grieving that. But I think one of the things it showed me was that, life is short, and sometimes tomorrow doesn't come, and you don't always have, the next day. You can't, always put it off. And so I think for me, I sort of, I live my life more intentionally and more purposefully, because of that experience, primarily. I think it just resonates more with me. But in terms of prioritization, once again, I do believe that when you have a relationship with God, I think that helps you rightly prioritize. And so you can certainly pray about how to prioritize, because there are a lot of good things in this life, but not everything is best, right? So I talk about good, better, best. And so figuring out what is the best thing to do for you right now. And so, to prioritize, again, my faith is really important to me. So I have to do things that, I can't do anything that would make that secondary. Like, there are a lot of good opportunities that come my way, but, for example, for me, working on a Sunday is just not something that is a non-negotiable. And I try to, have my life set up so that first things can be first. And so that is informed through my faith. Family is another important thing. My children are really important to me. So I've actually tried to have, professional situations set up so that I can, prioritize my family. So you really have to, I can't really tell people what that should be for them, but I think that if you have a relationship with God, I think that does help you sort of orient your life a little bit, better.
Now, you talked about the loss of your father, who died fairly young.
Yeah, 66. He was 66 years old.
How did you take that? Because a lot of times people have crisis situations and they get stuck. They live in it, they swim in it. How did you take that situation and turn it around to your advantage?
Yeah, so it took some time. I'm not going to sit up here and tell the audience that I didn't struggle, because that wouldn't be true. I call the book The Point of It All, because I actually question, well, what is the point of it all? Like, why are we here? Like, you live, you die, you could be a good person and nobody seems to notice it, But I had to remind myself, well, look at the life of Christ. Christ was crucified, and he was without sin. And so I really grounded myself, in my faith, and I chose to do that. And I chose to go back to the Bible and look at his life. And I was reminded of who he was and his purpose. And I drew the parallel between, my life. I did a lot of reflecting and looked at, well, kind of how has my life sort of unfolded? And I can see the grace of God in my life in this situation and in here and here and here. And it was sort of like the common thread, like God was the common thread in my life. And so I hope that answers your question, but that's sort of how I got through that. It was a reminder.
With your faith as the center of your life, how do you stay obedient?
Yeah, so it does require...
With so many forces. Yeah. There's just so many forces pulling at us nowadays, much more than when we were growing up.
I'm not always successful at that. And, sometimes I experience a consequence from that. I mean, God is a good God, and he's forgiving, and it's not like I'm punished for not being obedient, but I can see that, if I had, like there's, voices inside of us, or, and a lot of times I believe it's the Holy Spirit that sort of tells us, that's not the best situation, or this is what I want you to do. And it's like, this will be a better situation for me, like, materially speaking, I can make more money doing this. But a lot of the times when you take, when you make certain choices, you'll see the end result isn't, it's not the best scenario. So I'm not always obedient, but I try. Now that I'm more aware, I definitely try to get quiet enough to really listen to what God is saying to me and act, purposefully in that way. But I'm not always successful.
Do you believe, is this book for everyone, people of all faiths?
It can be. It certainly can be. I think that, hopefully people can resonate. Some of the ideas of prioritization and even, prioritization, that I think that's a principle that a lot of people can resonate with, as well as good, better, best, the idea of making, decisions, the best decisions. But I think that hopefully, if you do not, follow the Christian faith, this will inspire you, maybe give you some insight into what it is. It can be, if nothing else, if it's not something that, people who are from other faiths can, feel like, well, this is something I can use in my life, hopefully it'll be informational. But I think it's probably more tailored towards folks who are, in the faith or open to the faith.
How can fear prevent you from being all you can be? Having that mindset, you might have this great idea, and you start whatever it is, and fear can just paralyze you.
That's so very true. How do you overcome it? Well, so clinically speaking, treating trauma or, folks who have, phobias, the prescription isn't to continue to avoid those things. One of the prominent features of PTSD, for example, is avoidance. People avoid, large crowds, for example, or avoid, situations that, are reminders of whatever they experienced. And a lot of people are in prison, emotionally or, psychologically behind that fear, because it prevents them from living their lives. I had patients who, hadn't been to the movies in years because of this fear of, being, assaulted in a movie theater, and that stopped them from, like, their dating life, with their spouse or, whoever has gone down. Like, their quality of life goes down and suffers. So the prescription for, anxiety related disorders like PTSD and phobias is not to continue to maintain that avoidance and, continue to avoid those situations, but it's actually to confront it. And so there are different approaches that help people do that. And so I would encourage, folks who are dealing with the paralyzing nature of fear to confront the fears. It sounds cliched, but that's really the best way to go about, moving forward in your life.
We talked earlier in our discussion about how the book is broken down. You have antidotes, takeaways, and challenges. So tell us about those.
Yes, so the antidotes so I talk about these distracting mindsets. And so these distracting mindsets are things that either I have dealt with or I've observed in my, in my clinical work or even in my personal life, mindsets that people struggle with. And, mindsets sort of, guide, how we operate in our lives. There are the ways, there are our thinking patterns and, just how we view our world. And so I provide, the anecdotes are the ways that you sort of treat these distracting mindsets. The takeaways is sort of like a summary of the chapter, because I know that it can be kind of dense. Some of the chapters are a little more dense than others, and so I don't want to lose people. It was my desire not to lose people in the book, and that's why I broke it down so as clearly as I could. And so the takeaways are like short ways to kind of recap the chapters, and then the challenges are ways to challenge people who might be struggling with a certain mindset in their lives, or who may want to implement the principle that's discussed, and challenging them to do that, because I want people to grow with this book. I want it to challenge people and to help them grow in their faith if that's their desire.
Let's talk about how you can make success your lifestyle. It can be part of who you are every day, 24/7.
Being intentional, really being purposeful in your decisions and your actions. Try not to, you can rest and, have relaxation time, but try not to just go through your life just, not thinking about the consequences of your action or how certain decisions can impact the future. And so that's one of the ways that you can make it a lifestyle. It's not so much a destination, and that's how I used to live my life, as a people pleaser and as someone who was very success driven. It was, when I get to this thing, then I'll be, good to go. And when I get to the next thing, I was just constantly setting these goals. Goals are great, but there has to be a bigger picture and a bigger purpose in mind. And so I do talk about a larger overarching purpose, and I talk about our unique purposes, which are, kind of guided by our unique giftings and things that we're able to do and we're gifted with.
We're living in a society where a lot of people are traumatized for several reasons. One of the traumas that a lot of people are dealing with now are school shootings. How do we deal with the violence? Not just school shootings, shootings on the street. I work for a radio station where every weekend we're reporting on how many murders, have been in the DMV. How do you deal with life's traumas yet live a success-driven lifestyle? Mm-hmm. And this is for kids.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so, there's certainly ways that you can, be empowered. I think a lot of the times, because it's happened so much, I know I personally have sort of felt, disempowered. And it's like, well, what can we do? It's like, every time you look up, and then there's the whole idea of, gun control and, making some, stronger regulations regarding that. I certainly believe there's a place for that. I feel like there's several different fronts and several different approaches that you can take to the problem. I think there's several different problems, but there's ways that you can impact our society for the good. And so recognizing where you can make that impact. I know that personally in my church, they had a petition going around to sort of appeal to legislators about gun control. And so I took an initiative to sign that petition, and that was one way that I felt like I could contribute. There are other ways you can contribute, and I think that there are resources online that you can look for to sort of get involved. There was the march recently on the 24th, and there were a lot of people that were able to go out to that. There were children out doing that, and so that was so encouraging. Those sort of things inspire other people and inspire hope, and so where you can get involved, do get involved. Also, I would also say take care of yourself as a mental health professional. We talk, and you're also in this industry when you talk about self-care and how important that is. Sometimes you do have to, detach, for a moment and take care of yourself and pour into yourself. Still do the things that you like to do, you enjoy, and try not to allow the terrorists to do what they do, in the cases where terrorism was involved, which, prevents people from, they're so fearful they can't, continue to live their lives. And so.
You talked about, earlier we talked about PTSD. You've spent some time working with people who are dealing with that.
Yes.
What was that like?
Well, it certainly, it was challenging from the standpoint of hearing some of the difficult situations that people had been in, and just amazing tragedies that they had lived through, but it was also inspiring because a lot of the people were able to get better and move beyond their fears. And again, it's a gradual, it's not going to happen overnight, and you may never be the same, but just to see people being so committed to wanting to get better and wanting to be able to re-engage with life in a way that was meaningful for them was just really inspiring, that the fact that they had that resilience to do that.
And PTSD, again, stands for?
Oh, post-traumatic stress disorder. Yes.
And a lot of people coming back from?
The war, Afghanistan, like just the different, yes, and being exposed to combat. I saw a lot of combat-related trauma, but I also have seen, other traumas that people have had, childhood traumas, sexual trauma. And so it's just amazing to see the resiliency of people and just how much that they can overcome.
Now, your book is available where?
Yes, it's available all major places where you can buy books, Amazon.com. It's also at BarnesandNobles.com. You can get it on ZulonPress.com, which is actually the self-publisher that I use. So it is a self-published book, but I used a publisher.
How long did it take you to do it?
About 2 years.
But you did it.
I did it.
And I want to make sure we have the name again. It's The Point of It All,
Mm-hmm.
a faith-based guide to successful living.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yes.
Make sure we show it.
Yes.
And of course, we'll give all of your information
Yes.
at the end of the program. And it was a 2-year process. It was like everything in life, it was a process.
It was a process. And so for some people, they say 2 years, like, well, that was quick, you know, because some people, it does take a while. And I'd like to, I'm not saying that, you know, I've figured out, you know, everything that there is to know, but I think this is a book about becoming and about, you know, making an effort to live purposefully and intentionally. And I hope that that resonates with people and they can walk away with that lesson. I also wanted to say there is a book signing this weekend on Saturday, April 7th, from 5 to 7:30 at Busboys and Poets in College Park, Hyattsville.
Okay. Now, this might air after that.
Oh, okay. That's okay.
Last question. How are you balancing your life as a mother, as an author, as a professional? What's the balance, and how do you have that successful daily life, yet you're balanced?
Yes. I think that's a great question. I think it goes back to prioritization and also how you define success. You know, a lot of times I'd like to get more likes and tweets and all that kind of stuff on social media, but I know right now there are certain priorities in my life that I just are non-negotiable. I do believe that, you know, with time I'll be able to do more and make more appearances, but it's really about prioritizing, and I have started to prioritize self-care more. I was in a situation before where I really wasn't able to prioritize it as much, so now I'm able to do more of that. And so you really have to, it comes down to priorities.
Very good. Again, the name of the book is The Point of It All, A Faith-Based Guide to Successful Living. Welcome again to the show,
Thank
Dr.
you.
Renita Gabriel.
Thank you.
We'll have you back again when you do part 2.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all.
You've been watching the Sisters for Fitness Wellness Show. I'm Stephanie Gaines-Bryant. Have a great day.